I'm Lori Van Agren, Interim Associate Provost for University Outreach and Engagement, and I have the great privilege of welcoming you all to the MSU Global Engagement Speaker Series. Sponsored by International Studies and Programs, University Outreach and Engagement, and the Graduate School, the Global Engagement Speaker Series invites individuals of distinction from higher education, global organizations, and philanthropies to share their thoughts, research, and practice with the MSU community. Advancing understanding and dialogue about fundamental human rights and meeting basic human needs is at the core of the series, and speakers highlight the role of higher education as a collaborator, working with civil societies, governments, and industry to enhance societal well-being. In addition to those of us participating on campus, presentations in the Global Engagement Speaker Series are being live-streamed, and we invite online viewers to submit questions or comments they may have for our speaker through the live chat feature that accompanies the live stream. We will share these submissions during the question and answer portion of the presentation. It's now my pleasure to welcome and introduce you to Dr. Adnan Hamad, President and CEO of Global Health Research, Management, and Solutions. In that capacity, Dr. Hamad oversees global health collaborations and research initiatives and establishes links between researchers and scientists in the Middle East and North Africa region known as the MENA region, as well as their counterparts in countries with Arab immigrants such as North America. Dr. Hamad is the immediate past Senior Director and founder of Access Community Health and Research Center in Dearborn, Michigan, the largest and most comprehensive Arab community-based health and mental health center in North America. He's also he currently serves as clinical professor at Wayne State University's School of Medicine, Department of Family Medicine, and Public Health Sciences. He's also adjunct assistant professor at Michigan State University's College of Human Medicine, Department of Obstetrics, Gynecology, and Reproductive Biology, and is a consultant at the University of Michigan's School of Public Health. During his career, he's advocated for a holistic approach to address the healthcare and research needs of the Arab American community in the United States. Dr. Hamad is here as the guest host of today's program for the 2018-2019 Global Engagement Speaker Series. Please join me in giving him a warm welcome.
Thank you, Lori. Thank you, Lori. This is a very kind introduction. Thank you, Miles and Bert and Vint for being good partners in actually hosting this wonderful speaking engagement. I'm not a stranger from Michigan State University. The most important thing about me that I am a father of 3 kids who came to this university, Ausman and my daughter Saris, who are still senior students here. So I'm really proud of this academic center as the hub of education for a very diverse group of our community, including Arab Americans. It gives me a distinct pleasure and honor to be able to welcome and present a very important public health leader from the Middle East and North Africa, Dr. Iman Nuwayhid. Dr. Iman Nuwayhid is a professor and dean of the Faculty of Health Sciences at the American University of Beirut, Lebanon. He received his MD from AUB and his MBH and Doctor of Philosophy in Occupational Health from the Johns Hopkins University. He's also American board certified in occupational medicine. Dr. Iman Nuwayhid is a co-editor of the landmark book on the public health in the Arab world, published in Cambridge University Press in March 2002. He currently co-chairs the Lancet AUB Commission on Syrian Health in Conflict, which is another landmark publication that captures our refugee health in the MENA region. He's a strong believer in interdisciplinary and community-based research. and has successful bridges his 3 areas of specialization in medicine, general public health, and environment and occupational health. His professional career and research interests include ecosystem approach and human health, eco-health, and environmental determinants of health, and have mostly focused on the impact of work and the work environment on the health of workers, especially working children and marginalized population. His research has informed several health policy decisions, particularly for working children. Decree 8987 and worse forms of child labor in Lebanon, September 2012. In his capacity, Dr. Nuwayhid, he covers and is engaged, Dr. Nuwayhid oversees and engaged in substantial research, articles, and policy work of the Faculty of Health and Faculty of Health Sciences, members on multiple health priorities in Lebanon and in the region with a focus on conflict and health. These projects are mostly led and facilitated by Faculty of Health Sciences Center for Health Practice, Research on Population and Health. As a friend, I have to say that Dr. Nuwayhid has been a pioneer in leading a public health, the public health full spectrum related to underserved population, not only in the MENA region, but around the world. Please join me and welcome Dean Nuwayhid for his speaking engagement.
Thank you, Iman. Okay, here I am. So as Miles said, this is your moment. So good afternoon to all, and I'd like to thank every single one of you for being here, taking the time to actually join me in this sort of journey of reflections. And I would like to thank all those that are connected through our media channels. And hopefully we'll spend some interesting time exchanging some ideas. I'd like to, and of course I want to thank the organizers of the Global Engagement Speaker Series. I think this is a wonderful effort of trying to bring scholars and practitioners from all over the world to share their thoughts on things that could be happening. Let me start with some disclaimers and clarifications. This is going to be a 50-minute plus minus speech. So we're going to have hopefully the discussion and the questions answers after that. What I'm presenting today is not a research study, is not the results of a research study, is more of a reflection and a sort of a concept note. And so this is a conceptual paper more than a research-driven and data-driven paper. And some of you might have been at the Access Conference in Washington, D.C. in September. So this is work that actually I've presented part of over there, and I presented it in more than one occasion because I think it's so important to start engaging different audiences in the concepts that I'm presenting here. I think you'll sort of connect with what I'm saying as I move forward. The last thing I want to say that as I'm moving through my talk and slides are being forwarded here, some of the slides might not match what I'm talking about, so that you don't feel disconnected. So I would be maybe pointing to some points. So some of the slides are actually an illustration of what I'm talking about, rather than the details of it. So that's sort of you're better oriented to the presentation. With that said, let me take this thing and put the reading glasses on, and we'll start. Okay, so I'll be talking about political determinants of health, although the title focuses on the Arab world. The conceptual framework and what I'm going to discuss actually applies in different contexts. So this is a different way of looking at health and talking about Jamal specifically. So let me start. Jamal died on June 30th, 2018. This is what his tombstone actually reads. He was killed in the city of Algiers, the capital of Algeria, and is buried in Aleppo. So the aims and objectives of my presentation are going to be sort of describing through the story of Jamal, looking into some of the challenges to public health in the Arab world, and through that presenting a conceptual framework to understanding of health, underscoring the role of politics and political contexts when we speak about health, and using our institution, our school as an example, advocating for an institutional approach to the engagement in health, and then finally share some thoughts about what could we do together at the global level. It was June 30, so I searched the archives of several, and I said he died in Algeria. So I searched the archives of several daily Algerian newspapers, looking for the news of the murder of Jamal at the age of 29 at the hands of his uncle and cousin. He was stabbed to death, his sister in Beirut told me. Unfortunately, I could not find any reference to the incident. I checked the issues before and after June 30, in case the reported date is wrong or the reporting of the incident is delayed. I had no success. Jamal's sister knows who killed her brother by name, and close to a year later, she is still hopeful that they will be found and brought to justice. Since we know who killed Jamal, my talk this afternoon will ask, what killed Jamal? What really killed Jamal? Demonstrating that Jamal's life, and in fact the life of every single one of us, is determined to a large extent by the political and social contexts we are born into and in which we grow, live, and work, and also by how we perceive ourselves and how others perceive us. Jamal's story is not unique. It is simply intense, and I'm humbly and respectfully narrating it to introduce you, as I said before, to health challenges and to challenge ourselves as public health academics and professionals to start looking differently at what health is. Jamal was born in 1991 into a Kurdish family in the city of Aleppo. He is the sixth of 8 children. This Syrian Kurdish family of 10 people, father, mother, 5 boys and 3 girls, lived under one roof. And as if not enough, they took under their care an orphaned child, making them 11 in total. Jamal and his family lived in one of Aleppo's informal neighborhoods. So let me tell you more about this neighborhood. Luckily, a study was conducted in 2004 that collected information on more than 1,000 adults between 18 and 65 years of age. It was a young population, with the majority of people actually younger than 45. 24% non-Arabs, similar to the family of Jamal. 73% came from urban areas. This doesn't apply to his family because actually they've been living in that area for generations. Surprisingly, 65% of that population, adult population, are either illiterate or have basic education. I'll tell you why it's surprising. And the average household income is less than $200 a month, which puts them actually in the sort of the poorer category. Looking further on the job and exposures of the working man in this the younger age, 76%, 77 are in non-sedentary job. And when we look at the occupational exposure, 70% or 67% have severe exposure to respiratory pollutants. So again, this gives you a background on the neighborhood. When we look at the household features there and environmental conditions, they're not bad. So access to city water services and city sewage is actually more than 90%. And it's a dense population. And what they complain about is outdoor noise pollution. Jamal's family, as I mentioned, fitted most of the profile. The father was illiterate, and he worked as a dentist. The first time I heard that, I was surprised until I understood that a street traditional dentist, a profession that he inherited in the family. And so he carries his tools around in a suitcase, and he tours the streets of Aleppo to pull out decayed and rotten teeth. Except for 2 of his children, who learned basic reading and writing, none of the others, including Jamal, went to school. So when I talk about illiteracy, this is what's surprising. What's surprising when you look at the literacy and primary education in Syria, and this is before the war and the crisis, you find it's really in the high 90s, and you see here that more than 90% of the people are receiving primary education. It dropped with the war, but if you look at the population I was talking about, the majority was in the illiteracy category. So the question one would ask, that the services was there and the schools were there, and so how come Jamal and his brothers and sisters did not go to school? So Jamal's sister actually confirms that they lived close to a public school, yet they did not access that school. A similar, actually, a question could be posed when we think about health services. So the right to comprehensive healthcare is constitutional in Syria, and you find that population have access in the more than close to 100% to health services across the country. So the question is, the services are provided, it's education and it's health. How come people are not using it? So is it inequities in access? Is it the uneven distribution of these centers of human resources, or is it a cultural barrier or a choice? To support his family, the father had to extend his work to Beirut, Lebanon. So he moved back and forth between Aleppo and Beirut with the whole family. So and he moved between Aleppo and in Beirut. He chose to live in the Burj al-Barajni Palestinian refugee camp. Okay? So please keep in mind these electric wires that are connected between the buildings. Come to that a bit later. And so again, luckily, the health and environmental conditions in Burj al-Barajni camp were surveyed in 2002. And what we see there, we see that illiteracy here and up to 6 years is 42%, which is sort of much lower than what we saw there. And the household income self-report is less than 300, higher than the neighborhood that neighborhood in Aleppo. But you have to take in consideration that the city of Beirut is a more expensive city. When we look at the household features and environmental conditions, it was analyzed or looked at differently, but you see that the environmental problems here are much higher. So while there, the access to sewage and water services was more than 90%, we see here that most of these households report really poor environmental conditions within and outside the households. Why is that? So the refugee status of Palestinians is an example of a protracted crisis in the region. Since 1948, when Palestinians were displaced out of their homes in Palestine, many Palestinian refugees and their descendants have been living in camps around the region, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Jordan, and in Gaza Strip and the West Bank for more than 70 years. They receive health and education and social support from UNRWA. The UN Relief and Work Agency was established in 1949. UNRWA currently serves more than 5 million registered refugees in these different camps. In Lebanon, of course, the same issue, but in Lebanon, Palestinian refugees are deprived from their basic rights. They cannot own property, and the land that was allocated to Palestinian refugees in 1949 has not expanded. So they're not allowed to expand beyond the piece of land that was offered to them. Hence, that explains, one, what we've seen in the previous slide, explains the high crowding index, and explains the poor housing and environmental conditions there. On top, the Palestinian refugees are barred from practicing in more than 30 professions, especially the professional, the doctors, engineers, lawyers, and all of that. These are all blocked for the Palestinian refugees. Jamal's father worked as a dentist, same profession. His clients came from the camp and other underserved poor neighborhoods of Beirut and other cities in Lebanon. The boys, however, had to pitch in. So Jamal, less than 10 years of age now, and his younger and older brothers became street vendors or shoe shiners. Jamal's sister confirms that the girls were not sent to work. But the trip between the two cities ended when the war in Syria started in 2011. These are some photos that could remind us of what was happening in Syria and across. And so what Aleppo itself joined the inferno in 2012. And most of the informal poor neighborhoods that were sort of the focus of the study, if you look here at the red dots, they were actually, these neighborhoods were taken over by different opposition groups, became targets of heavy bombardments, especially in 2014 and on. Across Syria, health professionals and healthcare facilities were targeted, leading to the full or partial destruction of many hospitals and health centers, the killing of more than 800 health professionals, and the exodus of more than half of Syria's 30,000 doctors. People fled their homes to seek refuge within and outside Syria. Even now, after the active fighting has stopped in most of the country, there are still more than 6 million that are internally displaced, and 6 million that are living mainly displaced to Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt, and of course Europe and beyond. More than 1 million Syrians moved to Lebanon, spread all over the country, but concentrating mainly in the peripheries closer to Syria. So these circles are bigger population. And so they've moved more towards the poor and underserved communities in Lebanon. Close to 50% of those were children, with 40% of them working and 60% out of school. And now we're talking about a lost generation that we need to deal with as things settle down. Except for one brother who was drafted into the Syrian army, Jamal's family stayed in Lebanon under a new, now legal status. They are no more migrant laborers with no legal work permits. Now they became refugees registered with the UN. Unfortunately, life turned sour on the family. When an older brother of Jamal living in the camp was electrocuted on a rainy day when he was fixing the heating cylinder. He was survived by his wife and 4 children, 4 months to 7 years old. A few months later, the mother left, and Jamal and his sister had to step in. Jamal worked longer hours in the streets of Beirut to support his nieces and nephews, and life became harder by the day. His parents, with 1 brother and 2 sisters, sought refuge in Algeria, taking a direct flight from Beirut airport. This is important because this thing changed with time. Until then, most of the countries have welcomed Syrian refugees coming over. As his parents settled in Algeria, Jamal struggled to protect the 4 children. With his sister, they succeeded to register them with the UN system, and with the help of a local NGO, the children were accepted into an orphanage where they have been living for the last 2 years with 4 other orphans in a house under the supervision of a surrogate mother. They all attend schools. Relieved of this burden, he entrusted his nieces and nephews to his married sister with 4 children living in the camp and decided to leave. By then, Syrian refugees were less welcome by countries over the world. Syrian and other refugees took huge risks in pursuit of a new life and better opportunities. Tens of thousands attempted Europe by land and by sea, and hundreds died on the way. More than 200,000 refugees arrived in Europe by sea in 2014, 1/3 of them Syrians. Europe panicked and pushed back. The US and other countries too. Remember, only a few thousands came into the US when more than 1 million Syrian refugees are hosted by Lebanon, a country of 4.5 million. Jamal decided not to go to Europe and instead join his parents in Algeria. His only option, though, was to sneak in. He flew to Sudan and he was smuggled into Algeria through Libya. Presenting himself with no official papers, Jamal was registered by the UN system as a Syrian refugee in Algeria. Life settled down, and he worked as a waiter in a restaurant. 8 months later, he got married. He was never happier, his face never brighter, his sister recalls. All believed that life turned a new page for Jamal. Not for long, unfortunately, not for long. His niece, married to his cousin, was victim to domestic violence. She called for help, and Jamal volunteered to mediate between his niece's family and his cousin's family. He was not given a chance. He was ambushed by his cousin and uncle and stabbed to death. It was June 30, 2018, his sister says. There was no mention of Jamal in the newspapers the next day or the days after. The case is clear, a homicide where the victim and killers are known. It's a matter of time when the murderers are brought to justice and the case is closed. But is that the end of Jamal's story? And what can it tell us? After all, what is in a story? The Nigerian novelist Chimamanda Adichie tells her story and encourages us to tell ours, but warns of the danger of imposing a single story on a continent, on a race, on a religion, on a country, or on a region. People, institutions, and countries, she says, are the outcome of multiple stories. Jamal's story belonged to him, and in many aspects, it might not be unique. It is unique, but may not be different from the stories of many children and youth around the world who come from poor, disadvantaged backgrounds. His story, however, is not about poor people. It's about the failure of systems and the depth of inequity and injustice that engulf our lives. Kira, an African-American woman, presents such a powerful and telling story. In its January 2019 special issue, the National Geographic reported on the future of medicine. The writers spoke about the bionic eye, a virtual cadaver, and precision medicine that will revolutionize medical education, clinical analysis and diagnosis, and management of disease. It's science fiction come true. It is a time when some believe disease may be conquered. However, the special issue ends differently. The last article reports on the high maternal mortality rate in the US compared with other high-income countries. The US is doing much worse than most of the countries. This is where the US is. All of these countries are doing better, and some are doing worse. When analyzed by race, African American and Native American women rank highest. Further analysis, however, finds that it's not socioeconomic status only. Kira was a well-educated, successful African woman, and she died 48 hours following a birth of her second child in the hospital. Kira and her husband Charles, also a successful African American, did all that is recommended: antenatal visits, proper monitoring, healthy diet. Everything was well planned, and for all practical reasons, all should have ended well. Kira complained of severe abdominal pain after a successful, uneventful delivery of a healthy baby. Her complaints and the pleas of her husband that something is wrong were heeded as insignificant and not a priority for the nursing and medical staff. Intervention came in too late, and Kira died of an internal bleeding at the hospital. We know how Kira died, but what really killed Kira? Was it the loss of blood that killed her, or was it racial discrimination or combination of multiple factors? As for Charles, he says that more than anything, I want people to understand that these women we're losing are more than statistics. Their mothers, their daughters, their sisters, their friends. There's no statistic that can quantify what it's like to tell an 18-month-old that mom is not coming home. And yes, Charles is right. Jamal, Kira, and million others are more than statistics. In public health, we mostly speak in numbers: means, medians, standard deviations, prevalence, incidence rates. And as we do this, we frequently miss the human beings and the stories behind those numbers. Our colleagues in medicine head in the other direction, diving deep into organs, tissues, and genes, frequently leaving the human being and her story behind. This schism, although real, need not persist. Personalized medicine and advanced medical interventions will not succeed without a deep understanding of the economics of health, efficiency and efficacy of healthcare systems, access of people to health services, whereby the individual is core to medicine and medical practice. Public health prioritizes the good of the public, the population, over the good of the individual. I have no intention to settle this debate this afternoon. The message I would like to share is that individual stories inform us of the pitfalls of medical care and the pitfalls of the public health system, and even beyond. We all start from the same point of individuals, and sometimes we tend to forget them behind. These stories are not solely stories of individuals. They also narrate the stories of their communities, their countries, and even the globe. We can learn and change if we listen well and ask the right questions. So who is Jamal? Is he a Syrian or a Kurdish Syrian? A street child, a proxy father, a displaced person, a refugee, or a migrant worker? How do we categorize Jamal? Perhaps as an illegal immigrant, an illiterate, a young man, a Muslim, and Aleppan? Who is he after all? I guess many of us in this room may ask the same question and realize that we are all the outcome of multiple identities and multiple experiences. Being American, for example, is one attribute that connects many of you, but will exclude me and others. Being a health professional will lump me with some of you, but will exclude others. Add gender, place of work, place of residence, hobbies, etc., and we'll find that we are very, very similar and yet very different. How important is identity in deciding our health, our life, How does it define us? How can we use identity to enrich us and protect us from harm? And why does identity frequently cause us harm? Back to the question posed in the title of my talk, what killed Jamal? Jamal fell victim to multiple types of violence. In fact, he lived a life course of violence. The official records and statistics will report Jamal's death as a homicide. I doubt it will mention that he was the victim of a family feud and of domestic violence. So what truly killed Jamal? Is it economic violence and deprivation? Is it missing on education? Is it the poor environmental settings he lived in? Is it the feeling of social exclusion as occurred in Syria? Is it the political violence? Is it the military violence and war that destroyed parts of his city and neighborhood? Is it the xenophobia and discrimination that he might have experienced in Beirut? Is it the lack of statehood? Or is it the failure of the global political order? Applying a conceptual framework, I can define 3 spheres that influenced the life of Jamal and that influence our lives. Every single one of us. A social sphere, a political sphere, and the predicament of identity. I start with the social and economic sphere. The social determinants of health are the circumstances in which people are born, grow up, live, work, and age. Public health, with its critical assessment role, has done well in highlighting the social, economic, and environmental determinants of health. Research has shown that health varies with socioeconomic status. The wealthier do better than the poorer. The educated live longer and are healthier than the less educated. Maternal and child mortality decreases with education and wealth. Migrant workers are less advantaged than nationals. And health status varies with race and gender. At the global level, these inequities repeat. Life expectancy in Africa is lower than the rest of the world. Mortality and morbidity from communicable and other preventable diseases are more abundant in poorer countries. Malnutrition claims the lives of people in these countries. Smoking has become a leading killer in the global south. Even within countries, one of the strongest indicators of a country's ill health is the gap in income between the lowest earner and the highest earner. As for the Arab world, it has witnessed significant improvements in social and environmental conditions over the last century that had a positive impact on health. More than 80% of people in the Arab world have access to water and proper sanitation, and immunization coverage is almost complete. Polio has been eradicated. Literacy and schooling have followed an upward trend. Access to health care, better education, and improved infrastructure have contributed to better health status. These overall indicators paint a rosier picture than the reality because the Arab region is not consistent. Most of these health indicators lag behind in Yemen, Sudan, Somalia, and sub-regions of other countries. They also lag behind among particular population groups within each country. As you see here, some countries did not achieve the MDGs and others did. Our region is very heterogeneous in distribution of wealth, in history and culture, in political systems, in environmental changes, and consequently in burden of disease. So if you look at the different countries in the Arab region, compare the low income to the middle income to the high income, you see that the burden of disease shifts from the communicable to the non-communicable diseases in this region. Our region now faces multiple challenges. It hosts more than 30 million refugees and displaced persons within and outside its countries. Close to 50% of all displaced and persons and refugees in the world. It is a young region with around 60% of the population below the age of 30. Its population, now at 350 million, is expected to double in less than 50 years, with more population growth in the poorer countries. On top of that, our region suffers from water insecurity. So this is the Arab world, and the average water here, cubic meters per person per year, is in the 700, while the world average is 7,000. Same for food insecurity. And the rising impact of multiple climate change, with the Arab world being a biocapacity debtor, again, one of the worst regions in that respect. Even for countries where health indicators were improving, conflict and war have reversed these achievements drastically, which takes me to the sphere of politics. Although Rudolf Virchow, the father of social medicine, stated in 19th century Europe that politics is nothing but medicine at a grand scale, political epidemiology, which examines the relationship between politics and health, is relatively a new and weak field. Defining politics as the structures, processes, and outputs that affect population health, and analyzing the European experience, it was reported that higher levels of democracy are associated with higher life expectancy and or lower mortality. However, the process of democratization was associated with higher mortality from several causes of death and even a temporary decline in life expectancy. That's the experience of Eastern Europe, and that's an experience that our region is passing through. In our region, authoritarian political systems, occupation, conflict and war, and the remaining vestiges of our history of colonialism have dominated the political scene for a long time. In spite of reasonable achievements at the health and education fronts, people revolted and demanded change and freedom of expression at a very high price. The loss of achievements is most strikingly observed in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. In the 1980s, Iraq ranked among the top countries in the region and global south in terms of health indicators and social and economic achievements. Similarly, in Syria, in spite of significant inequalities within the country, free or almost free healthcare and education were provided to all, and a high proportion of medicines was manufactured within the country. All, or almost all, of these achievements collapsed. As mentioned before, Syria now is in its 8th year of its civil internationalized war, has more than 6 million internally displaced persons, has lost more than half of its doctors, has observed the total or partial destruction of many of its healthcare facilities. Health was used as a weapon of war. Now, this presents a serious challenge to public health and other health professionals. Besides engaging in the provision of healthcare and humanitarian support, we are practically paralyzed in the face of raging wars and violence. Yet, public health professionals continue to insist that health must be separate from politics, that it is apolitical. Can it really be so when the reality is that politics, political circumstances, and power imbalances are major determinants of health? After all, it is politics and policies that define distribution of wealth and services, including health services. And it is politics and policies that prioritize development choices. The fact that expenditures on the military exceed expenditure on health in our region, as documented by data back from 2011, even before the recent events, is a political decision. It is politics and policy that marginalize the poor and send them to wars. It is our political choices and policies that can explain why 1% of the world's population own more than 50% of the world's wealth. It is what explains inequities in our countries and globally. As indicated above, examples in the Arab world are abundant as they are elsewhere. How can the 1 million cases of cholera in Yemen be seen as anything than a political determinant of health? How can the cutting of funding to UNRWA, with its huge repercussion on the well-being of Palestinians, be seen as anything other than a political determinant of health? Public health is political, and we must concede this if we stand a chance of trying to enhance health. I now add a new complexity to this already complex picture, a third sphere of influence besides the social and political, which is identity. And this is embodied in the life of Jamal and Kirat. Kelly and Millward defined identity as how one regards and judges others and how one regards and judges self. It is how we regard our skin color, physical look, gender, accent, dress attire, all our self-identity, and how others judge these same visible aspects. It's the social identity. It is also how we regard our religion or culture and how others judge and label others based on those non-visible abstract attributes. This is a sensitive and challenging concept, no doubt, and some would lump it under political or the social determinants of health. I elected to single out the concept of identity because I believe that it sits at the center of our humanity and human values. It defines our sense of justice and equality, and it is used as a tool to make policies and even wage regional and global wars. Who is Jamal is a question I asked before. Jamal's identity was valued differently over the different phases and circumstances of his life, by Jamal himself and by others. A Kurdish, a Syrian, an illiterate, a migrant worker, a refugee, each of these attributes defined a part of Jamal's identity and carried a value to him and others that came with implications, different services, and expectations. Same for Kira. At a critical moment of her life, being black affected her medical care and probably was the reason she was not saved. She was proud of who she was, but her identity was perceived differently by others. This is the photo of Alan Kurdi that shook the world. Until he was photographed drowned by the sea, he was simply another 3-year-old Syrian boy. He became a symbol, and his image reminded us all of the brutality of wars, of our impotence in stopping them. By the way, Alan was Kurdish, like Jamal. So what can be done? Before I attempt to answer, let me share with you what Mehdi thinks. Mehdi is a 47-year-old man, father of 2 children, who was born in the town of Rashaya in the southeast of Lebanon, and his house actually faces Mount Hermon. He was our guide last summer on a 15-mile hike through the mountains between Rashaya and Hasbaya. He knew the mountains very well since he herded goats there for more than 20 years. When I relate to him the public perception that goats hurt the environment, he simply pointed to a plant to make his point. Honeybees, he said, honeybees love to collect honey and sugar drops from the flowers of what might seem to be an insignificant plant to many. It is the best honey bees can find. But these flowers survive for a few weeks and the plant dies up gradually, becoming delicious food for the goats. Our ecosystem, he said, is rich and diverse and can accommodate all of us. It's not honeybees against goats. It is simply about how can honeybees and goats live together and allow other living things to survive and rejuvenate. It's not nature, he said. It is us and the choices we make. Within each of the 3 spheres that influence our health and lives lie the elements of a choice between what should be done and what can be prevented and stopped. We should continue as public health and other health professionals to focus on improving the social determinants of health, but we cannot continue to dismiss addressing the political determinants, including the issues of identity. We owe it to Jamal and the millions of youth globally who are falling through the cracks as victims of unjust political and economic systems and as victims of social exclusion based on identity. Over the last 8 years, war, intolerance, and terrorism are what labeled the Arab world in the minds of many. The images of brutal wars and actions wipe out all the good that is concurrently happening. For example, the horrible fact that more than 6 million Syrians have fled their country to the neighboring countries should not undermine the fact that 4.5 million Lebanese have hosted more than 1 million Syrians in their tiny country. The despicable fact of foreign interventions in Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Libya, and other countries should never dilute the power of giving and humanitarian aid to the victims of these wars and atrocities. People who are killing and instigating wars and people who are aiding refugees and the displaced share similar nationalities, same religions, same gender, same history, and same language. It's not our identities, it is our politics and values that unite or separate us. We have a choice of either celebrating diversity and valuing our multiple identities as individuals and societies, or transforming it into a source of divisiveness and exclusion at the local and global level. Are you an Arab, one is asked, a Muslim, a Christian, a Jew, a black, a Hispanic, a Hindu, a Kurd, a Sunni, a Shiite? It is this attempt to put persons into single identity boxes that transforms richness of diversity into conflicts. Religions and religious practices which embrace tolerance, cohesion, comfort, and love have been expressed in hatred, intolerance, violence, and rejection. This was used as an excuse to label whole countries and regions as innately violent and extremist and justify a global war on terror. As health professionals, as human beings, we should celebrate, value, and uplift our differences and our multiple identities, and we should not shy away from examining such identities and their impact on health and life. And yes, there is a role for universities in addressing each of these three spheres, which in turn have defined our own stories and history as institutions. I will share a bit of our story as a university and our actions as a school. I come from the American University of Beirut, AUB, whose campus that overlooks the Mediterranean Sea is probably among the most beautiful campuses globally. It has been declared a botanical garden and a bird sanctuary. The university was established in 1866 under the name of the Syrian Protestant College. Its name changed to AUB in 1920, just to talk about the impact of politics and history, when Greater Lebanon was declared after the defeat of the Ottoman Empire in World War I and the division of the Levant into new states according to the 1916 agreement between Sykes and Picot, the British foreign minister and the French foreign minister. These are the lines they drew to divide the region. The college's mission is to serve the Arab and Middle East regions, nurturing liberal education, tolerance, and freedom of expression. And its links and roots in the region run deep. It graduated most of the leaders of the region in the 20th century. And its academic space allowed its professors and students to be actively engaged in the dynamic political changes of the region, including World War I, World War II, establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, which was accompanied by the displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, the repeated Arab-Israeli wars, the civil war in Lebanon, Israeli occupation of parts of Lebanon, the current concurrent conflicts in the region. This has challenged our university and other institutions and forced us to re-examine our role repeatedly. This is true of its faculties and schools too. Our Faculty of Health Sciences, FHS, which is the first and leading school of public health in the region, has committed to a role of engagement, of asking the difficult questions and not shying away from understanding the politics of health. Institutionally, we have built 3 independent yet interactive centers around research, practice, and knowledge to policy, knowledge translation. These 3 centers, together with our disciplinary departments, they delve into complex and sensitive public health issues. We published a book on public health in the Arab world as a platform for voices from the region, and we have now a public health in the Arab world online community. And we also led a special issue, a Lancet special issue to analyze health in the Arab world from a political perspective, January 2014. Currently, we are leading the Lancet AV Commission on Syria, which is deeply current, deeply political, and deeply sensitive. The commissioners are successfully documenting the impact of the Syria crisis on health systems and poor and people's health in Syria and the region using a social and political lens of analysis. Our latest vision is quite daring, and we aim to see our faculty as the leading academic voice and driver for peace, equity, justice, and better health in the Arab region and beyond. But no institution can do it alone. So what can we do together? As health professionals, we should recognize the confluence of the 3 spheres of the social, the political, and identity on health in each country and at a global level. We should collaborate at the domestic, region, and global levels on building human resources of health, exchanging expertise and resources, supporting institutional building, including comprehensive and just health systems, conducting joint research, and implementing and monitoring intervention programs to measure failures and successes. As citizens of the world, we should sing the song of diversity and tolerance and advocate for peace and justice. We should be willing to discuss and dialogue with others who have different views from us about the same events. Short of that, our successes and achievements in health and education and others are constantly under threat. And finally, we should listen to the stories of people who have no voice. So to Jamal, the illiterate Syrian Kurdish street child, to Kira, the literate, independent, dreaming African-American woman, and to Mehdi, the environmental friendly, nature lover, goat advocate, Lebanese middle-aged man, I bow in respect to their individual stories and to the many lessons we can all learn from those who are marginalized, stereotyped, and not listened to. Thank you.
I much appreciate having that personal view put on in combination with population data to be able to make that so meaningful. I think we have time for questions and answers at this point. What we'll do is, if you raise your hand, I'll come and give you the microphone, and just make sure you can speak into it. We want to make sure we capture it for the streaming.
Good afternoon. Excellent presentation. The American University of Beirut was planning a Global Health Institute, and can you comment on their ASSIST program, which offers assistance through the Global Health Institute, which offers assistance to refugees?
Yeah, so the institute was built with the intention of bringing the different faculties and schools to work together on some issues. So the work on refugee health and refugees actually is spread out throughout the university. So our School of Public Health, School of Nursing, School of Medicine, School of Engineering, Agriculture, Arts and Sciences, Business, all the different schools are doing a lot of work within the sort of the context of refugees. And the institute is trying to pull on these resources to sort of advance that. So the work across the university, including the work of the institute itself, it's actually on one part, there's some sort of support that is given directly to the refugees, but that's minimal. Most of the work is around capacity building of the refugees, trying to invest in the resources and assets among the refugees themselves, research to understand and uncover some of the intricacies of their health problems and their access to the health system, trying to understand how the health system in Lebanon is dealing with the issue and how can it sustain itself and keep providing. One of the major challenges with the issue of the Syrian refugees, that Syria is a middle income country. And so the Syrian refugees came mostly not with your the more traditional model where you have refugees coming with infectious disease and your worry is about water and sanitation and shelter. They actually came mainly with non-communicable diseases. So most of the humanitarian agencies and the health system was challenged to deal with cancer, diabetes, cardiovascular disease. So you're dealing with advanced health problems there. So the university is engaged in the training, in research, some services, and collaborating with UN agencies and NGOs, local and international, on that. Okay. Hello.
I was just wondering what brought you to the story of Jamal specifically?
Jamal was actually, I said that he's a street child. He was a shoe shiner, and he worked in our neighborhood. And so he befriended my sons, and through that I got to know Jamal and then part of his family. And then it unfolded as we moved on.
Thank you for your presentation. I really appreciate bringing up the social political aspects of health. I approach this as a social historian, public health and social historian who's worked with Syrian refugees in South Lebanon, as well as UNHCR and the local NGO SHIELD there to look at social and health disparities that exist. And my question for you is in regards to how do you just address the institutional inequities that exist within the context of Lebanon, in the sense of the healthcare system itself, both for Syrians as well as for Lebanese who are socioeconomically impoverished, or in the sense that in the last year or two, UNHCR is no longer recording or documenting Syrian refugees, so their access to the assistance from both international agencies as well as the local agencies are also hindered. So I think it's great that we address the social political issues, but how do you deal with such drastic institutional and structural issues, both on the local as well as the international level, that really hinder their ability to address these health concerns?
Yeah. So what actually, your question actually has practically confirmed all what we're talking about. So when you talk about the Syrian refugees, what you have brought in is international players, is regional players, is local players, is the health system, is the change in the value and identity of those people, and how important they are to the international system at one point and less important with time. As the war started cooling down in Syria, or things have changed, then and now no more refugees are coming in the country, so now you're talking about sending them back. And so this actually confirms the fact that our value of things and our services are very much determined by the political moment and that by priorities at the international and the local level. And it won't be surprising that if things cool down a little bit more, that the world will turn their back and start focusing on another disaster somewhere and forget about that, which actually explains why the funding has dwindled and the needs have increased. So recognizing that fact is actually the main message of my presentation. Recognizing that when we're doing public health and when we're engaging with these issues, that there are all these multiple layers that are impacting our interventions. So the health system in Lebanon is mainly a private health system. So that was one of the major challenges that the country would face. You're talking about more than 80% of the health system, the hospitals, health facilities, are actually privately owned. and the government has it like less than 20% of the share of providing health services. So what the Ministry of Public Health has done to sort of fill that gap, they said that if you don't have social security, because not all people have social security, if you don't have an insurance through the army or internal security or through whatever profession you have, you can come to the Ministry of Public Health and you could be admitted to hospitals for care under the name of the Ministry of Public Health. So you become a Ministry of Public Health patient. And the Ministry of Public Health covers part of that cost. Now, when the Syrian refugees came in, what the ministry was able to provide is access to the healthcare centers, but not the secondary and the tertiary care. So they cannot be admitted to hospitals because the ministry focuses on the Lebanese. So that's where the humanitarian agencies and UN agencies face the problem that you're dealing with a system that is totally different than perhaps what they're used to. It's not state-oriented. And the provisions have changed. So the UNFPA, I think UNFPA, together with or UNHCR, together with the Beirut Hariri sort of governmental hospital, they've developed a program that provides maternity care for Syrian refugee women. So that was sort of a special thing. The issue of chronic diseases has not been resolved because the cost of medications and providing that was now things are even more complicated with the fact that the funds are being reduced, to the general perception that it's time for the Syrians to pack and leave, and so that all of that is impacting that thing. So part of what we do as a university is try to sort of monitor and follow and study these things. So I don't know whether I've answered your question.
Another question?
One, two,
Here, and then I'll come to you, Edna.
Thank you so much for your presentation. And question, have stories always been integral into your own approach to your work? Or was there a point in time where stories all became more important?
That's a very interesting question, challenging one. I love stories myself, and I find that there's a lot that can be learned and told through stories of individuals and communities. But if you come to my talk on Thursday at the School of Public Health, University of Michigan, I'll be talking more about my personal story and research and institutional story. So one of them, for example, I'll just give you the example of the Sirdab. So I'm an occupational health academic, so I was doing the study on construction workers in Lebanon. It was in the mid-90s. So I haven't been in Lebanon. I've returned in early 1992, so it was a few years there. So I was doing my sort of regular occupational health work and trying to assess sort of the risk, the knowledge and practices and perception of risks of injuries among the Syrian construction workers. So I was at that site, which ended up becoming the hospital, the government hospital in Beirut. So, and I was talking to the Syrian, interviewing the Syrian workers there, and one of the questions were, where do you live? And people would say Sirdab. And then the other one would say Sirdab. And the third one, I had my research assistant with me, and we both sort of collated information. Everybody was talking about Sirdab. Sirdab is, of course, an Arabic term. And in my mind, Sirdab is like a tunnel. So I thought maybe, I don't know, are they living in what kind of place? What is that thing that they call Sirdab? So, so I asked them for directions. Where is this Sirdab? And they pointed to the location. So 2 days later, towards sort of sunset, I came with my research assistants, 2 of them, in a car and start touring around to look for a building where I thought that there's an underground parking somewhere there. And I couldn't find a building in the whole neighborhood. And so there was a Syrian army checkpoint. I stopped there and said, where is the Sirdab? And the person there said, Sirdab, how do you know about the Sirdab? And I felt that I'm trespassing here. So I said, I was interviewing people, I met this person, and he told me that he lives in the Sirdab. So where is that? So he pointed to the area, at the place. I couldn't see anything. He said, do you see that coffee shop there facing it? So I go there, there's nothing in the land. There's some steel roads coming out of the land. And it turns out that they were building this building, so they went down 6 floors that were supposed to be underground parking. They stopped at the street level, and the war started, so they couldn't continue to build it. So when I went into this thing and started going down, it was a vertical shantytown. And amazingly, on every floor, you had streets, you had shops, vegetable, fruits, DVD shops, coffee shops. And not only that the people were gathering based on their towns and villages and where they come from, all men. So that was one of the sort of the experiences that sort of pushed me back. I'm saying, I'm spending the time asking the questions about their injuries and the safety at the workplace when they're living in a building, underground building, where then when it rains, all the water collects down, and it becomes sort of a cesspool practically. And that's when these experiences and stories sort of strike you, and you say, well, you're looking at this worker in it's sort of a small part of the bigger context that he's living in. And you're assuming that their perception of injuries, and you're trying to intervene in changing their perception of injuries and the risk of injuries, when actually their whole life is actually in a different place. So that kind of experience and the repeated ones sort of pushed us back. And I would say as a school as a whole of saying the question is, we cannot look at these things as a technical intervention without looking at the bigger picture of how the people are living, what it means to them, what does life mean to them, so what does injury mean and health mean in a setting like this. So I think that's the kind of experiences that I feel sometimes that they can carry a bigger message and stronger message than saying, I interviewed 100 workers, 30% didn't wear, 90% didn't wear boots. And all of them, or they cared about injuries and they didn't do about them. And rather than seeing them as ignorant and wearing slippers at a construction site, you can understand better who they are. And you can, if there's a chance of intervention, it is better. And we did not intervene, unfortunately, because when I visited the place, a security guy pulled me out with a gun to his side saying, you cannot come here. So that's where sort of all these elements collate, and we need to be aware of.
Dean Nuwayhid, are you hopeful for the region?
Generally speaking, I'm an optimistic person. Okay, so sometimes I see the good in even in the evil that is happening. I don't think we have an option right now. I don't think we have an option. If you look at the facts and figures, it's very hard to be hopeful. You're talking about a region where like 10 countries are in conflict. You have millions of people that are displaced. The divisions and the hatred and the sort of disagreements are many. Add to it, I mentioned that the population will double, so think about it. If you have a population that is doubling in 50 years, in an area, a region that is currently food insecure, that is currently water insecure, that is under threat of climate change, just put these things together and you have a horrifying picture there down in the future. But it's exactly because we know that this is the way we're heading if we don't intervene. I would say that there is a hope and a responsibility that to work on that and to realize and admit that we cannot do it alone. So I mean it when I say that there's a need for a global thinking about inequities and injustices. And that when we look at those problems, whether we look at Africa or we look at our region, the MENA region or Asia and others, that we usually tend to look at them as local problems that should be solved by the local people. And we tend to forget that there's history there. Look at Africa, the whole issue of colonialism and division of the country, the continent, breaking it up, slavery and all of this. You cannot escape the reality that this is impacting the health status of today. And so there is a global, historical, and actually into the future responsibility of doing something. Am I hopeful? I would say that there's no other option for us but to keep engaged.
By the way, I loved your presentation.
Thank you.
Great presentation. I'm an undergraduate student
Mhm.
in social sciences. I have two questions.
Okay.
So my first question, what was your methodology for this research and your fieldwork experience? My second question, since you talked about the struggles of Jamal and Mrs. Johnson, I wanted to know about your difficulties or the challenge that you face while conducting your research.
Okay. So, as I explained in the beginning, so to be clear about that, this is not research that has been done with that sort of kind of methodology of doing it. This is, I would say, an accumulation of observations, experiences, self-reflections, maybe going back to Dr. Hamad's question of being hopeful, optimistic, pessimistic, what can you do? And it's this sort of reality of that you work so many years, and I'm saying not talking about a person, I'm talking about institutions, agencies, and all this. You work for years to build an educational system, a health system to improve the health of people, and boom, war comes in and wipes everything out, and you're pushed back to start rebuilding again. So it's that kind of sort of living experience that we need to reflect on. So I don't know what kind of research you would call that, but it's mainly sort of reflective on my own personal experience, the experience of colleagues, the experience of the region and institutions, questioning why are institutions sometimes afraid to collaborate and engage especially in our region, because they're worried about the authoritarian political systems, and they worry about connections, and they worry about doing research and all of that. So that's sort of a mix of the methodology and my personal experiences of that. We learned quite a bit from our colleagues in Birzeit University in Ramallah in the West Bank. So when we started interacting with them, and they visiting Beirut, and we started maybe not always doing research together, but reflecting on research questions together. It was for us, researchers in West Bank and Palestine, doing research under occupation. So the whole concept of how do you survive, and how can you do research in a situation like this, and how can you use research to tell your story. So this becomes sort of the other way around. So our colleague Rita Jackaman has challenged the WHO tool and instrument on measuring quality of life because it's so Western-based. So in the context of the West Bank, when you ask people about quality of life, it's about them waking up and going to work without being interrupted, stopped, or beaten on the way. And so the questionnaire that she used to develop quality of life, that was actually community-based and through qualitative work, included questions like, have you ever been stripped naked in the street? Okay? And have you ever been beaten by soldiers? Has your wife been exposed to certain violations? These kind of questions, when you look at them in an instrument, they sort of force you to start thinking differently about how to conduct the research, and the fact that I personally see again that even when you do research and pose research questions, these things are, it's not an abstract way, I think. The way you pose questions and the way you conduct your methods and collect data is actually driven by certain values and certain priorities. So we've learned quite a bit from that experience. And when we were ourselves hit by repeated conflicts and wars, and then in the region, it sort of came together that we need to start looking at the wider spheres. Just again, a sort of a tangent to this. Our school in 1984, and then in 1994, we published 2 books. I was involved in the second one, not the first one. The 1984, remember, it was civil war, 2 years after the Israeli invasion and even the invasion of Beirut. And so in 1984, they conducted the first household survey in the city of Beirut. Systematically done properly, the random sampling, everything is as usual. You look at the book of 1984, and we did the follow-up in 10 years, the book of 1994. Now I reflect on my own experience. In both books, there is no mention of war. You could take that study and plug it into any city in the world. It talks about the household characteristics. It talks about how many times you visit the dentist and the physician. It talks about environmental conditions within the house. It talks about all of these, but as if war did not exist, as if those people did not live through a war. And that side of question has sort of dawned on me, is like, how could you live in a civil war for 15 years, conduct studies related to war and impact on health, but not see war as a context or as a topic of research and study? So with the Syrian crisis and the influx of refugees, I think the whole region, and I would say the whole world, including MSU, are asking questions, and researchers are asking questions about what can we do with Syrian refugees? What can we do with the whole question of conflict? How can we intervene? The size of the problem, the concurrent crises in the region, is forcing, I think, researchers, institutions globally to question some of the priorities and how they be engaged. Are there answers? I'm not sure, but it's important to start asking the questions.
Hi.
Hi.
Iman Nuwayhid, I never get tired of listening to you. Thank you so much. To build on the question and what was said, perhaps the research that my mind is going to is around resilience of public health systems and health systems. And given that throughout history, the patterns repeat themselves, and there's always unexpected, unanticipated emergencies that throw off the work that you're saying we're starting over. Perhaps the research becomes, how do we build that resilience? How do we build proactive systems that can be a shield against these unexpected things? At my institute, the Michigan Public Health Institute, researchers have looked at flip sides of things when it comes to maternal and infant mortality that you also discussed as something that's related to racial inequities and other social determinants. They did a study on maternal resilience. So black babies die at a higher rate, but some black babies don't die. So the research went to why is the mother who lives under comparable circumstances, her baby is surviving. So they studied that factor. So I'm not saying that's the only thing that can be done, but my mind went to that aspect of research that can happen under adversity to prepare for what's inevitable, unfortunately, that will come over phases and generations.
So I'd like to sort of support what you're saying of the importance of looking at what circumstances or conditions or attributes allow some people and some communities to be resilient. But we have to be very, very, very cautious about the term, because it's a slippery road. And this is something, again, that we're realizing as we're doing that work. And this is one of the points that I'm trying to make in this presentation, that it's important to build people's ability to resist and do things, but it's very dangerous, and it's important for us not to accept the injustices, the failing systems, the wars are as inevitable. So, because if we accept these things as a given, and this is what I'm warning against here, let's not accept injustices and inequities as a given and start now looking at how can people live and survive, recognizing that yes, there are injustices, yes, there is racism, Yes, there is all of this. Recognizing that, what can we do? We need to do this without failing to be advocates and activists in trying to point to the source of the problem. Otherwise, we become complacent within that. So I know that where you stand and where you come from, but I wanted that we all sort of keep in mind that, and this is what the message I'm transmitting here, that as we do our work as public health professionals, academics, and we need to continue to do what we have been trained to do not forget that there are other spheres that might be disrupting our work. And we have a role in making sure that the wider circumstances should be changed. I always remember that example, I think I used it yesterday or so, that when I was doing my MPH or training in public health, so the exercise was, if you receive, if you have $1 to spend on an X program, okay, how do you spend it best? So the idea is how to be efficient and how you spend the money that's allocated to your program. And there's a question that we shouldn't miss. Why is only $1 allocated to that program? Where are the other dollars going? And I think there is a role and a responsibility for us to use that dollar the most efficient way, the most effective way, but keep insisting and asking that questions. Why are the other dollars going to places that are actually destroying health and undermining health and undermining all your successes and achievement? Because perhaps if they spend less money on wars and killing and arms, perhaps even if they stop that, you improve the health conditions even more than our program. So we need to keep that link always open.
I totally agree. I'm somebody who doesn't like the word resilience too much. I used it here because of the same reason that it reveals some kind of acceptance. But to me, perhaps the use of that is to look at models and replicate, build on those models and make them successful to shield and change, to change systems. So to learn from the resilient and not accept their circumstances. So let me just clarify that.
We agree.
On the scientific committee, you should remember Dr. Arnett that opposed the word resilience.
We're on the same page.
You know what I mean, I hope.
No, I wanted to make sure that it's clear to at least.
Yes, absolutely. It's not.
It's a concept that is.
Let's see, well, if she can make it, no, it's not that. It's to discover what is success.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you all for your really phenomenal questions, and thank you, Dean Nuwayhid, for coming and speaking with us. And
thank you.
I think that having speakers like Dean Nuwayhid are exactly why we wanted to be able to have this speaker series. I think none of them have really focused over the 3 years, right? Have really focused on a particular research study, but have taken larger contextual views of what's happening and helped us understand, think about the structures. And the community engagement is particularly I think I'll never forget your story about the underground shantytown and how we will never see those issues if we don't get out there and talk to the people who can tell us what those problems are that are important to them. So
thank you for having me. Thank you.
Here. So we so appreciate your participation. I want to thank you for the many visits and meetings. I know we keep you very, very busy while
Has
you're
been a pleasure.
here.
I have to say that the visit this morning to Flint was an eye-opener. You have a fantastic group there, and you're doing a wonderful job. It's just amazing.
And so if anybody would like to speak more with Dean Nuwayhid about the visit to Flint, too, and what commonalities or differences that he saw there, that would probably be very interesting. And thank you, Dr. Hamad, for being with us today, and your daughter. Thank you for coming, and for your gracious and generous collaboration in helping to organize Dr. Nuwayhid's trip to Michigan. International Studies and Programs, University Outreach and Engagement, and the Graduate School would like to thank the co-sponsors on the screen for their support of Dr. Nuwayhid's visit to Michigan State University. So this concludes the 2018-2019 Global Engagement Speaker Series, and it has been an honor to host 3 speakers this academic year. Norbert Steinhaus, who is the coordinator of the Living Knowledge International Science Shop Network, who was with us in October. Pauline Mujawa Maria Kobel, managing director of the African Innovation Foundation, who joined us last month, and Dr. Nuwayhid this week. For further information about speakers and to view video recordings of their talks, please visit the series website at gess.msu.edu. Share it with your colleagues. We welcome your suggestions regarding future global speakers for this series. And if you have recommendations for the 2019-2020 upcoming academic year, please talk with Burton Bargerstock, who's in the room today, or you can contact him at University Outreach and Engagement. And finally, please join Dr. Nuwayhid, Dr. Hamad, and the Global Engagement Speaker Series team for a reception of light refreshments in the room across the hall. Thank you for joining us today, and have a very pleasant rest of your day.
Thank you.